this presentation.
You there? Yes.
There we go. It's okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for staying. I was standing in the back waiting to see if you were all going to go, so I didn't have anything to do. I have a little bit of a cold, so forgive me if I have to stop and clean myself out here. I apologize. So one of the chores I have now, I was going to talk about amino acids. I don't have enough time, and besides that, this afternoon I have 90 minutes on amino acids, so we're going to plow a little bit of the same ground this afternoon, but we'll focus more on amino acids. So little introduction, management around protein, basic nitrogen metabolism, fermentable carbohydrates, and forage digestibility, indigestible protein, and then we'll take questions. And this is a really, I like when Rick goes through these things because, you know, we can kind of cut and paste things for dry cows, transition cows to a point. When it comes to nitrogen, this is kind of a free-flowing thing, right? Because every cow at a different stage of lactation has a different requirement. And we still get focused on sometimes the wrong thing as either a nutritionist or a professional. So, you know, why do we want to do this? Rick kind of set this up pretty well, and it's interesting that he used the concept of a pig because I'm going to come back to that. But why do we want to do this? Reduce feed costs per unit of lean gain or milk produced. We want a desire for more efficient yield of milk and milk components. And we'll come back to this too because I don't think it's really nitrogen and efficiency are a little, when it comes to milk yield, they're not quite the same thing. We want to make space. You know, the interesting thing, we see these, we do studies, we see things done in the US where we're going to pull the protein out of the diet. Well, when you pull the protein out of the diet, something has to go up. And normally in the US, what goes up is starch, right? So we'll see guys pulling, we have diets now that are down around 15% crude protein and cows making 42, 44, 45 kilos of milk a day, right? Very efficient on a nitrogen basis. But their starch is going to be 29 to 31, right? You guys can't do that. One, you don't have enough starch, but two, your fermentable fiber is way too fast. Your good grasses are way too good. I'll come back to that. So it makes it hard for you guys to get the starch in there and keep a good, healthy rumen. But it does make space. You know, we want to reduce manure nitrogen, or we're concerned about manure nitrogen use and disposal. I'm actually working, we've got a lawsuit going on in central New York now where they're saying a 200-cow farm makes as much waste as a city of 96,000 people. It's very bad math. But I've been spending a couple hours here the last couple days rewriting a few things so we can go back and counteract the lawsuit because it's actually going to damage a couple farms. You know, and then we want to decrease ammonia emissions. This is a big thing. This is coming in the U.S. We don't actually regulate ammonia emissions yet. California started regulating methane, so I'm assuming that they'll get onto ammonia here sometime soon. But we want to be more environmentally friendly. And what that leads to are things like this. You know, and I see this a lot in the U.S. I see this everywhere I go. Practicing nutritionists will formulate to a certain level, and as somebody who leads the development of a model, my goal or my objective is to take all the art out of nutrition, right? Some of you guys look like real heroes sometimes because you can't quantify everything. So you got to think through it and go, well, it must be this or that, and you make some adjustment. You don't really know what you did, but the cows responded okay. And you kind of move on and you say, okay, this looks good. But then there's all this variation around the farm. Right? And from my perspective, I want to be able to say, hey, these are the exact requirements of this cow. If you can't manage that, this is what the management value of having to add in some extra protein is worth, right? And that's a different way of thinking, but that's the way we're starting to move in the U.S. So I just have a 500 cow herd here with forage availability. We can do this, you know, we can do 40 kilograms of milk at 24 kilos of intake at about 15% crude protein. And I don't like crude protein. You'll see that again here in a minute, but that's what everybody knows. So we'll start there. At a nutritionist level decision, I want to make sure that I don't lose this customer and that the customer doesn't lose any milk. So I'm going to add some in. I'm going to add some protein back because they can't account for variation. How many cows are in the pen? Are there always the same number of cows in the pen? Is the pen static or dynamic? Is the forage managed effectively? Does the dry matter get done on a routine basis? All of these kinds of things. How often do we do forage chemistry? Maybe not as often as we should. So I'm going to add back half a kilo of crude protein or of soybean meal to get my crude protein up. Well, Now this allows us to actually quantify the variation. So, well, it's going to cost 18 cents a cow a day, or maybe about $33,000 or $65 a cow. Well, what we just did there is we quantified the variation in the inability to manage the variation around the cow, right? Because nutritionally, we can do this. Management, we can only do this. And as somebody who models a lot, I get people push back saying, Mike, you can't do that. No, I can do that because the model is supposed to predict accurate nutrients and supply. The management around it is an entirely different thing, right? Don't confuse the management around the cow with the biology, right? Those are two very distinctly different decision-making processes. So why the safety factor? Well, variability in nutrient content of forages and forage dry matter. Like I said, how often do you analyze? How often do you analyze the non-forage components? What do we know about dry matter intake every day, right? That's really important. The other thing that we should know about is variability in cattle groups and management. How big are the cows you're working with? I'm not going to talk about body weight. We did a nutrition training course a year ago, just a year and a couple weeks ago. I had 120 nutritionists from around the world. On Wednesday, we took them to our research farm, made them go guess the weight of cows because that's not what they normally do. On average, they were 120 kilos light. All right, and then they were yelling at me because they couldn't balance for 10 grams of amino acid. All right, and I said, nope, not my problem. Got to learn to weigh cows. Variability and digestibility of forages, variability and digestibility of non-forage sources. Most of the time, we don't have time to figure this all out, right? So we just add in some extra protein, put in a safety factor, and we keep moving, right? But that costs money, and it affects the environment. So what are we going to do? Well, here's part of the problem. Right, so this is from a study, Jimmy Clark's last study, Ignacio, published in 2005. Here's dietary crude protein. Here's milk yield, the impacts of source and amounts of crude protein on intestinal supply of nitrogen performance of cows. So let's just pick a common crude protein level. We got, I think, maybe 16.5 here. So at 16.5% protein, we're going from about 22, 23 kilos of milk up to, maybe 36, 37 kilos of milk. Is that good or bad? What does crude protein have to do with this? Yet that's the currency we all talk in. Does a cow really care? A cow doesn't care, right? What do we want to know from this information? Right, they did this study on purpose. They wanted to understand how well does crude protein, you guys will have to excuse me, how well does crude protein account for this, right? Well, crude protein is irrelevant. There's a big range here. What we want to know is what's first limiting. Is it energy or protein? And how can we figure it out? Well, that's where modeling comes in, or that's where good formulation comes in. This is where the nutritionist, you have to work with the cows, you have to understand the cows, you have to characterize the cows in the feed, and get whatever program you're using to agree with the cows before you make any change. Right? Rarely do we do that, but that's where we're going. Are these cows adequate on rumen nitrogen and deficient on metabolizable protein? Or are they deficient on rumen nitrogen and adequate on metabolizable protein? Those are two distinctly different requirements. The rumen has a requirement for nitrogen to make sure we can make enough microbial protein, and then a cow requires amino acids. Right? And one of our biggest problems has been partitioning the requirement between rumen and post-ruminal amino acids. Right? And we're becoming much better at that. Okay? The other thing that I want to bring to here, so we'll walk through some of that stuff. But this is a big one. We've got this aspect is something that we have to work towards if we're going to become more nitrogen efficient. We have to know what's first limiting. You can't make a change unless you know what the weakest link is. So the role of energy, nutrition, and protein synthesis, this Spornley paper in '89, discussed, and this was really the first paper to come out and say this, reported a much stronger relationship to milk protein percentage in dietary energy intake than did dietary protein intake, right? They attributed that to ruminal fermentation and microbial protein synthesis and looked at, things that digestible carbohydrates that drive milk protein yield. Well, there's more going on there than just that, and if we receive more bacteria from the fermentation of carbohydrates, what else do we get? When we get more VFAs, right? That's where the energy comes from. But when we get more VFAs, we get more propionate. Propionate goes to the liver, gets converted to what? Glucose. In response to that, what does the cow make? She makes insulin, all right? And the liver responds with more IGF-1. What do those two things now do? They send the signal to tell the cow to make more protein, right? So it's the energy that's actually driving protein synthesis. The protein just goes along for the ride to kind of fill the gaps in and make sure that the protein can be made, but it's not the protein itself driving this. In fact, a few years ago, Gerald Lobley wrote a really interesting thing in a paper. You know, he talked about protein-energy interactions. He said, oh, it's been traditional to consider protein and energy metabolism as separate entities in mammalian metabolism. Most scientists recognize this as an artificial divide. And we're moving in this direction. Indeed, they should be considered together, as this reflects how nutrients are ingested and utilized as part of normal feeding patterns. When as far as to say evolution, right? That's a little bit heavy-handed, but that's okay. The point is that one of the things that's really hard, how many of you have used rumen-protected amino acids before? How many of you have gotten a milk protein response? Okay, there's some hands. How many of you have gotten a milk volume response? There's more hands. How many of you have gotten a milk fat response? Perfect. Which one do we model? And how do you know when to model it? Because what did that just tell? So what do you learn from that? All right? So plenty of hands go up for each of those three questions. What do you learn from that? Adding amino acids, is that a linear response to milk protein? And the answer is no, absolutely not. What is it? Adding amino acids actually makes the cow more energetically efficient, right? It has nothing to do with protein per se. You're taking away a limitation. She now gets to use whatever energy supply she has more efficiently because she can put it into whatever pathway she has that she has a need for, right? And that's just energetic efficiency. So the idea that we do look at protein and think about efficiency is interesting. It's only as far as they waste it, but it actually doesn't correlate very strongly with how they use nutrients. Right, so to that point, milk protein output and overall protein efficiency is a function of energy supply. Amino acid balance enhances this efficiency of energy use and sometimes nitrogen use, but as you guys just indicated, it's not always direct. Here's where it gets interesting, because sometimes we can't move energetic efficiency. How many herds can you go into and take them from 35 to 40 kilos of milk in a few weeks? Right? It just doesn't happen, right? So it's not like we're going to go in and make these big changes in nitrogen or energetic efficiency. We have to work around whatever the cow's at stage of lactation, because we can only change things once we get a cow back into, get a fresh cow that actually peaks right. Right? I'm concerned with your question because I see a lot of them flatlining and we never get the peaks and we don't get enough milk. I saw that in Denmark. I can give you a couple case studies. And they didn't make any colostrum. Urine nitrogen is variable and is a function of an excess nitrogen intake. Urine nitrogen is also the most volatile form, so reducing it will reduce the environmental impact and improve efficiency. We can use MUNs. There's lots of correlations between MUN and urinary excretion or nitrogen utilization. I'm not going to talk about them today, but you could do that. We went directly, right? So here's some data, and this is, I think, the way I think, this is how I think about a cow. And bless you. You and I are feeling alike at the moment. So this is nitrogen excretion in milk, feces, and urine based on nitrogen intake in cattle under controlled conditions as energy is first limiting. So on average, these cows are all making about 40 kilos of milk. They're consuming about 24 kilograms of dry matter intake. And the crude protein intake range is 14 to almost 19, right? So here's milk, urine, and fecal nitrogen. And you can see that, so here's milk nitrogen. That's not milk urea nitrogen. That's milk protein converted to a nitrogen basis, okay? So what do you see on milk nitrogen? It's a flat line. What do you see about fecal nitrogen? It's pretty much a flat line too. It goes up a little bit. But what this says is it doesn't really matter how much protein we feed the cow. She's going to excrete what? Pretty much the same amount of fecal nitrogen. We can't change that much, right? But what she does do is as we feed more protein, especially above requirements, she does what? She just pees it out. Yeah. That's a wasted nitrogen. There's where we can have an impact, right? Because she's doing the balancing act. She's going to conserve that nitrogen. She's going to conserve the nitrogen down here, and where's she going to conserve the nitrogen to? She's going to push it back into circulation and make sure that the rumen has plenty of nitrogen to keep the bugs happy, right? But if she doesn't need it, she's going to do what? She's going to pee it away, right? Where are we at on most dairy farms today? You guys don't think about this, but I would encourage you to start thinking about this. You guys are out here. You're putting out more fecal and urinary nitrogen than you're putting out milk nitrogen, right? And that's not good, right? And that's what's wrong, partly wrong with our industry, and why people don't like us is because we have, excuse me, more of that than we have more manure nitrogen going out than we have milk nitrogen. What we're doing in the US is we're trying to get people to move in this direction. So our initial objective is, at least on productive nitrogen, we want to be 1-to-1 to urinary nitrogen. So if we can get, this is about 0.67, if we can get down here to 1-to-1, at least what we've done now is we've reduced, it's a direct relationship, right? So we've gone down almost 50 grams, over 50 grams, 70 grams of nitrogen, not crude protein, right? 70 grams of nitrogen is 400, 500 and some odd grams of protein, metabolizable protein. To get that to crude protein, you're almost at a kilo, right? So you just took a kilo of protein out of the diet, okay? So we want to get to this, and we can do this with our modeling exercises. Ideally, we can get down here, and when we get down here, cows are actually very efficient. We didn't really change overall energetic efficiency, we just got rid of the nitrogen we don't need. Again, as we get rid of the nitrogen, that brings up the carbohydrate levels, so we need more fermentable carbohydrates. And you can see that these cows, the other thing we learn here is that these cows are what? They're still making 40 kilos of milk at 14% crude protein, if you want to use that metric. How many of you feel comfortable doing that? Yeah, I won't show it here, but this afternoon I'll show you we got down to 13.5 at 42. Cows are remarkably efficient as long as you understand how we're partitioning the nitrogen, okay? So we got this problem, right? So we throw nitrogen, this is complex, right? Nitrogen goes in, a lot of it gets converted to ammonia, goes to the liver, ends up as urea, gets into the blood. Got a lot of decision making to go here, but it almost all goes through the kidney, and then the kidney makes the decision, do I push it back into the blood or do I push it out in the urine, right? It can go into the milk, that's how we get MUNs. As we go to this lower end, more of that's coming back here so it can go back into the gastrointestinal tract. That's our opportunity. As we flood the system with intake nitrogen, our opportunity to capture the nitrogen here is greatly reduced. Okay? And as it becomes greatly reduced because we just have too much nitrogen, it goes that way, it goes that way, and it goes that way. And so we're just trying to get this into balance, keep the rumen happy, and then focus on getting more metabolizable protein into the small intestine. So we just look at this. The dairy cows are really quite adapted to doing this. They're very efficient, right? So 50 to 70, and these are real numbers. If you go through the literature, 50 to 70, and if you do these studies, which I've done several of, 50 to 70% of nitrogen intake is converted to urea. 30 to 45% of that intake nitrogen is recycled back to the gastrointestinal tract. Their job is to keep that rumen happy and push that stuff around. We underestimate that. We don't even think about it. They do it. It doesn't cost a lot of energy. But we need to put diets together and manage the cows and improve that capture, because that's how we improve nitrogen efficiency. We have to rely on that, right? If you look at MUNs, just to do some practical things here, if you have good MUN data and it's calibrated appropriately, a group MUN of 6 would suggest you're right at negative rumen nitrogen balances. We know that once you get to about a 6 on an MUN, the rumen is really struggling to keep a positive nitrogen balance, just because that's how the pool works. And you can look across all sorts of data. People like me do that. So that's a good diagnostic. You want to be above that. 8 is good, and then you keep the rumen well in terms of nitrogen level. Feeding behavior due to things like overcrowding and related management, back to some of the questions that are things that I've heard discussed, will impact rumen ammonia balance. We can see that here. We're able to do this now in our new version of the model. Here's rumen ammonia. The break point is 5 milligrams per deciliter. That's here. So if we feed a cow consistently, we see a rumen nitrogen balance. It's just cows don't eat all the time, but if they did, this is what it would look like. The moment we go to 8 meals a day, we start to see these pulsatile responses in rumen ammonia because this is an intake and decay curve, but that's also ammonia is released. It either leaves the rumen through urea or to go to urea, or it goes into microbes they eat, same kind of thing. And then you see this. You go to 4 times a day, up and down, and this would actually come down like this. We truncate it because we start telling the microbes you're going to run out of nitrogen, so you can't eat as much carbohydrate and make as many babies, right? So, and it goes up and it comes down, and you see now that you would actually have these periods of deficiency when we start limiting meals. So if you have overcrowded conditions, we see this in the U.S. Some people will say, hey, I only get a response in certain herds when I put urea in the diet. Well, that's probably because you've got overcrowded feed bunks, or you've got too many cows per stall, and the cows can't lay down and chew and ruminate and eat when they want to, so you get into some of this kind of eating patterns. But it's not just affecting carbohydrate, it's affecting the protein side of it, and we can see this now as we start to model it. So big picture things, it really comes down to fiber and carbohydrate digestibility and metabolizable protein from microbes. Our goal is 50% of the MP should come from microbial protein, right? So if we're not doing this, we're not making best use of the rumen. It makes use of the soluble and inexpensive protein. It reduces the environmental impact. It reduces the need for purchased protein feeds. And this is one of the things that I'm surprised at when I come over here is I don't see you guys using a lot of protected proteins. At least I don't see them as uniformly distributed as I think they would. We use a lot of them in the U.S., right? Depends on what our forages look like. This increases income over feed cost. We like to focus on forage as a percent of dry matter should be at least 50% or greater. We're just trying to do this because, especially if it's high quality forage, so you can optimize rumen function, keep good bugs, and keep good chewing and rumination, right? Anything that enhances microbial yield is going to enhance nitrogen efficiency. Again, so fermentable carbohydrates, highly digestible forage. Since forage is the primary feed, right, that's really the primary factor affecting amino acid supply. And from a modeling perspective, the factor that actually affects amino acid supply more than anything coming out of the rumen is digestible forage, digestible NDF. And whenever we run all of our modeling exercises, it always comes down to digestibility of forage. But if you don't have good forage, you still got to figure out how to get good fermentable carbohydrates in there to maximize microbial protein synthesis. Here's a very simple experiment from Alex Christoph at Penn State. Fed chopped alfalfa hay, 73%. Dietary crude protein overall was 18%. Supplemented 3 different carbohydrate sources, about 21% of the diet. Glucose, cornstarch, oat fiber. Right? And what he was looking for is what are the nitrogen dynamics? So here's glucose, starch, and fiber. There's the ammonia production, right? So ammonia production fed the glucose was the lowest, 350 grams a day. Starch, 487. Now starch is going to carry some nitrogen into the rumen. Glucose is not, so that's part of this difference. And the fiber doesn't carry much nitrogen into it, but notice that there's a lot of ammonia production when those cows were fed the fiber. When you look at irreversible loss rate, this means how much of it gets peed out. Basically, it's going to leave the system 230, 343, 320. So the most efficient was the glucose. We see the most microbial nitrogen flow, although it's not statistically different. As we increase microbial nitrogen flow, microbial nitrogen from the ammonia, 75, 111. Bacterial nitrogen from ammonia, again, looking at efficiencies, we're getting much higher efficiency as we get more fermentable carbohydrate in here, although starch and glucose were not significantly different. But when we look at rumen ammonia, remember I said 5 milligrams was our kind of our cutoff point. They're still doing what? In all these cases, they're flooding the system with nitrogen. There's way too much nitrogen in that rumen. So we could afford to do what? We could put more fermentable carbohydrates in here to soak up more of that nitrogen to grow more bugs, because we're still overfeeding rumen nitrogen. But it just shows that as we take a high protein diet and put in low nitrogen, highly fermentable stuff, we can reduce that nitrogen content, but also make more microbial protein, and that makes the cow more efficient. We see a slight change in pH, but nothing remarkable. okay? Some of that comes back to just digestibility, and this was from the, I used this yesterday, Sam and I used this in our NDF workshop, but it basically, you know, you guys have really great grass silages, right? And as you look at digestibility of your forages, actually it's really remarkable. When we look at rates, generally we look at this integrated rate, so we're looking at decays, now we're looking out to 240 hours, but we get a KD of 5%. You guys will have KDs in that range or higher. What we're starting to do now is look at these pools, and when I look at a lot of the grasses that you have here in this part of the world, you have a lot of this fast pool. Matter of fact, you have sometimes too much, I think, which is why you get into trouble, which is why it's so hard to add more fermentable carbohydrate. All right, this is really, and we're starting to look at NDF this way, but my point here is that this is a corn silage, but I think the key is that you want to look at, if you're thinking about nitrogen efficiency is really a function initially of how good are your forages. And we're starting to disassemble forage into different pools. We see a fast pool and a slow pool. I won't spend a lot of time on that, except that as we see cows with larger, faster pools, we see more eating, we see faster ruminal disappearance, we see higher intakes, we see more ruminal buoyancy, and we get better chewing. All right, but we can say, hey, 72% of the NDF is in that fast pool, and that's going at 11% per hour, but we know the overall rate was here. Well, then we see this slow rate, you know, and when we see more of that, you know, things slow down, lower intakes, lower eating speed, we don't make as many bugs. This is going to make lots of bugs. This not so much. That's the indigestible component. We're just going to move on because that's worthless at this point. We look at some data from Irish pastures. Your grasses aren't quite as low in NDF as these are, but your high quality grass silages have very similar digestion curves, right? This is phenomenal at, you know, 33, 34, 35% NDF, going very, very rapidly and pretty much completely decayed by 48 hours. There's nothing like this in the US. But a lot of your forages behave this way. So you have this great opportunity here to make lots of microbial protein. Your key is how do you get enough of the other things into the diet to make sure that you can use up the nitrogen that's coming in with this. And this is a real struggle for me. I'm still getting my head around it, but this is where I think you guys have an opportunity for some of these room-protected proteins, right? Whether it's amino acids or it's simply like soy plus, soy best, soy pass, or whatever products you may have available here. You know, and when we look at, this is just legume, this is alfalfa, you know, so here, look at these good grasses and look at alfalfa, you know, that's 40 to 50% indigestible. All right, but you have grasses sometimes that are too mature and they end up looking like this, just like this legume. When this happens, you're going to struggle with nitrogen efficiency because you don't have enough fermentable carbohydrate coming from your forage to be able to make enough protein and produce enough energy and everything that goes with that. So what I'm trying to imply to you here is if you really want to understand nitrogen efficiency, you got to do the chemistry on your forages, and you really got to understand your forages. And I know that you guys don't do a lot of chemistry on your forages the way we've been doing it, but I would implore you that this is going to be one of your best first steps. So in doing that, it's going to allow us, I just said all of this, it's basically going to maximize NDF intake, keep the rumen healthy, and get more MP from that. But then you gotta, I would get you guys to consider room-protected feed sources, heat-treated soy, similar room-protected amino acids when cost-effective. Now, that leads to a couple things here. So if you're bringing in those things, and Rick made the point about a pig, what does every monogastric analyze for before they feed it protein? And what do they know? So we're at the point where we're starting to refine how we do this. How about intestinal digestibility? How many of us ever talk about intestinal digestibility in a cow? No, we don't do it. But if you formulate for a pig or a chicken, what's your basis of digestion or formulation? It's digestible amino acids. So if we're ever going to be better at nitrogen efficiency, what do we have to start doing? This sounds kind of funny, but we're going to have to analyze for this. You guys are going, oh, really? Well, yeah, because digestibility in the small intestine, amino acid profile is important, but digestibility in the small intestine is just as important because to Rick's comments earlier, we have people going to lower protein diets, but as you go to lower protein diets, crude protein, as I showed you, doesn't really describe anything. Right? It's MP. It's like meeting the rumen balance and then getting the post-ruminal amino acids. It comes back to what's most limiting, right? So we developed an assay. I'm going to go through it very quickly, but I want to show you kind of how this works, right? So if we do our feed chemistry, we have this soluble or undegradable true protein, or soluble true protein. It's 100% intestinally digestible. We say the insoluble is 100%. We say that bound to the fiber is 80%. This is historic, and you guys kind of use the same metrics, and then the C fraction is 0% intestinal digestibility. Well, we came up with this assay because we were finding out that there were a lot of people were getting into these lower protein diets and losing milk. Back to the safety factor, right? So we said, hey, the only thing that we're not measuring yet on a routine basis is intestinal digestibility. So we made this assay. It is a bioassay. It takes a couple days. Groups like Cumberland Valley are working on making NIR equations, so that'll make it easier. This unavailable nitrogen is used in place of ADIN or whatever you happen to use as your unavailable nitrogen. Just a couple examples. I'm going to use blood meal as my characteristic here of our feed to characterize. This was some work. Chemin paid for this. They wanted to understand blood meal. So we've got 22 blood meals. We've got a positive control and a negative control. And you can see here, that's just the nitrogen content of blood meal. This could be any protein. I could put soy up here. I could put canola up here. I could put distillers up here. And you see there's the average nitrogen. There's the upper bounds. And there's the lower bounds, right? So there's a standard deviation, 16.6 to 14.4. You guys have a lot of feeds like this too, right? The problem is we don't analyze it often enough to know what this variation is. But here's the bigger issue. This is intestinal digestibility. There's the mean, it's 61. There's the upper bounds, it's 80. There's the lower bounds, it's 42.9. Right? There was not nearly as much variation in crude protein as there is in the intestinal digestibility. So now what do? If you bought this blood meal, you look like the hero. If you bought this blood meal, you look like what? Well, you don't know. You just lost milk, but something didn't go right, and now you're being asked to go back and fix it. Okay? That's a real problem. We see this in all products that we've analyzed. Okay? So that's not unusual. The most interesting thing is this is one plant over 2 weeks. How's that? So even a single source is not reliable because they may not have the right controls in place. We see this from distiller plants. We see some distillers plants putting out really high quality stuff 1 week or 1 month, and then the next month they cranked up the temperature and it's just terrible, right? Because we get a lot of these check samples. Right? So again, to get more nitrogen efficient, you have to start looking at things like this, and we are starting to do this. How does it apply to a ration formulation program? Well, digestible protein in a cow is pretty much equivalent to metabolizable protein. I'm going to speed up here a little bit. When we built this assay, we had to find out if it was sensitive. Here's really high quality blood. Here's the same blood that we threw in the oven and beat up. And if we look at ADIN, we don't see a remarkable difference, but if we look at the in vitro outcomes, 16% indigestible, 93% indigestible. Okay? So regular chemistry, the way we've always done it, doesn't work. Detergent chemistry was never designed to do this kind of stuff. So where you end up is, this is what it looks like the way we currently do chemistry or have done chemistry. This is what it looks like with the new chemistry. Right? That bad blood meal is going to go out as very expensive fertilizer. Okay? So we see a lot of feeds, not this extreme, right? I'm using very big extremes here, but you got 79% digestible of your RUP and 0. Very few feeds are 0, right? So that's not a problem. Does the cow care about this? So we ran a study. I'm going to go fast through this because time is of the essence. Isoenergetic diets, all we did is change out blood meals. Again, we could do this with just about any protein. We just happened to use blood meal because it was available and we could move quickly. A very highly digestible blood meal, 9% UN, an average, not really poorly, this was the average blood meal at the major feed mill in our county. Right? It's just what was sitting on the floor. We just bought it, used it. Okay? This is what every cow in central New York was being fed. We balanced at a level of about 38 grams of nitrogen. The cows were consuming about 670, so we were at 5.8% of their intake. So we're balancing at a fairly low margin here. There's the diets. The big thing here is that we started out at 52% or 15.2% crude protein. Everything else was fairly steady. We put canola in the diet at 3%. I'm not showing you the diets in the interest of time. Halfway through the study, we took canola out because the cows were decreasing in milk yield and we wanted to remain sensitive to their MP supply. So intakes at about 27 kilos, eating around 670 grams of nitrogen. Milk volume, 42 and 40, so a 2 kilo difference. Energy corrected milk, 42 and 40. Fat was different. Protein was different. Fat percent was a little bit different. Protein percent was not different. Even the MUNs were significantly different here. Okay, so the moment they went on the diet, and the diets were isonitrogenous, they consumed all the same amount of nitrogen, you can see they immediately responded to that, right? So the cows will recognize this concept if we can predict the outcome, and this is as much of nitrogen efficiency as anything that we're doing right now. We modeled it. Initial body weight, not remarkably different. Body weight change, not different. Body condition score change, not different. Back to milk nitrogen efficiency, no real difference because we didn't grossly change milk output in terms of big volumes, right? A little bit, but not enough to really change efficiency. But cows did partition nitrogen towards body weight, so we accounted for that. We put that into the model. We changed place of ADIN, we used the UN values. And then we looked at the predictions, and this is where, as nutritionists, we have to do a better job, right? So the actual milk was 42 and 40. The ME allowable milk predictions coming out of the model were 46. Is that good or bad? What do you guys think? Is that good? Cows are making 40 and 42. The energy allowable milk is 46. Is that good or bad? Most people say that's bad. Do you think it's good or bad? Don't know. He says it's bad. It's bad because it says we should be able to make 46, but we can't. Why can't we make 46 kilos of milk? Because we're protein limited, right? But Will knows that. Will's very quick. You have to sit and talk to him all the time, and he'll pester you as he's driving down the road trying to figure out where he's going. He's still throwing questions at you. Anyhow, it's all fun. If we use the standard chemistry, 45 and 45, right? Lines up pretty well with the energy, but it's still insensitive to this. If we plug in the UN values, all of a sudden what happens? All of a sudden we line up. So what it says is, if you take the time to actually put in the cow data and the diet data, guess what you can do? You can actually predict what's first limiting. Well, now you can control your nitrogen efficiency. Because until you get to this step, what change would you make? If you guys walked on the farm and you saw this, what do you do? Because you're thinking, where are those 3 kilos of milk? And you're going to chase your tail trying to find those 3 kilos of milk. And the 3 kilos of milk are in the fact that her protein wasn't that digestible, but we just have that as a library input. All right, so like I said, we can do this with all sorts of other feeds. We did the
Sorry, is some of the energy being lost by virtue of the inefficiency? So
no energy's lost.
It isn't?
No, it actually reconciles. Yeah, that's why I showed, so if you back up and you do all of this body weight gain, it all lines up. Yeah, it all lines up because they're only producing to the level that the protein will allow, because protein's first limiting. And I think that's the key, is that we have to decide what's first limiting. And very rarely do we take the time to do that. There's no energy loss here because they are putting it onto body weight and body condition score. This was a 9-week study, so not long enough to really see that big change. No, it's a good question. There's no wastage here. It's just simply, I don't have enough amino acids to actually make any more milk. I have plenty of energy to do that. I don't have the amino acids. And all it says is where our previous chemistry was what? It's not about, you know, and when I challenged Pete Van Soest about this, Pete's the one that came up with all this, right? This whole ADI and NADI thing. I said, Pete, I don't think it works all the time. And he lectures me and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't work, right? We can do the financial calculations on this, but we're going to run out of time here. We actually did. So this is the opportunity cost of unknown difference in digestibility of the blood meal. Could be applied to any protein supplement. So at the time we did this, we had pretty high milk prices. So this is milk prices the way we do it, dollars per hundredweight. Right now we're kind of in between, but here's a low milk price, intermediate $17.50 and a high at $25.60. This is where we peaked out in 2015 or 2014. This is the opportunity cost due to 1 percentage unit difference in digestibility. This is dollars per month per 500 cows, back to the 500 cow herd. And even at a low milk price, there's money to be gained by knowing this, right? And if you've got a good milk price, there's more money, and if you've got a great milk price, there's even more money, right? There was no way that this would ever be negative at any milk price, right? So the point is that knowing this is always going to do what for us? It's going to make us money, right? So in the end, after we modeled it, I told you we formulated at 38. We got down to 32 grams or 4.8% of nitrogen intake. You know, our challenge is getting the variation in feed and management accounted for properly, you know, and understanding what's first limiting is important. But this ability to formulate with this precision, you know, gives us a lot of opportunity, right? But it takes time. It takes time to analyze, get data, communicate, all that kind of stuff. So in the end, we got to determine what's the most limiting nutrient, energy, or protein. Do the cows and the model or your formulation software agree? Evaluate rumen nitrogen balance and urine and nitrogen excretion. If either one of those are high, then work to reduce the soluble protein. If grams of MP are in excess, then that one's real easy, just get rid of it. Once you have those two things in balance, now you can focus on amino acids, and I'm going to do this afternoon. We're down to looking at it on a gram basis and saying, hey, if you're feeding 60 mcals of metabolizable energy, you need 1.12 grams of metabolizable protein per unit of energy to meet the cow's requirements, or at least get you close to what we think the requirement is. And then just multiply that number by 2.7 to get your lysine number. So we're moving in directions where we're trying to get very specific about these numbers. Now, and if we do it in a modeling basis, the CNCPS actually calculates a rumen nitrogen balance. So we know crude protein is not relevant. Ruminal N balance should be about 110 to 120%. MP balance should be greater than ME balance by about 5%. Get the urinary nitrogen excretion as low as possible, you know, and that, you know, based on forage availability inventory while maintaining ruminal nitrogen balance. Once you get rid of the extra nitrogen, now you're going to fill the void with something else. Once you do that, you get more fermentable carbohydrate, you make more bugs, so you got to go back to 2 and make sure you get enough nitrogen. And then after you've got that all set, now you can go focus on amino acids. Right? There's a hierarchy here of how we do this, but you really got to be able to separate out those requirements, okay? And with that, I'm done.